Okay, so this is urinary system part 2. Urine formation. We talked a little bit about how glomerular filtration happens and that when substances move or the blood flows into the glomerulus and it's forced out. So this material is going to move from the blood into the glomerular capsule. Tubular reabsorption is when stuff moves from the renal tubules back into the blood in the peritubular capillaries. So things like we want to keep, like glucose, proteins, stuff like that. Tubular secretion is when material moves from the blood in the capillaries back into the renal tubules, and things we want to get rid of, like drugs and ions, because drugs are bad. Okay, so let's talk about the filtration. Glomerular filtrate passes through these fenestrae, so these little slit pores in the capillary endothelium. So they're just going to pass through here. So anything small enough to fit through will get forced out just by that high pressure. So the blood's coming in through the afferent arterioles and will move into the glomerulus, and then the efferent arteriole is where it goes and flows back into the capillaries. So don't memorize this list. This is more an idea of the concentration of things, say in the plasma, what's in the filtrate, and then what we excrete. So sodium, you see relative concentration, 142 in the plasma, and then filtrate 142. So it all gets filtered out, but then we must reabsorb some. Okay, because we have to reabsorb some to make it because we need that sodium. So every day you have about 180 liters of filtrate formed, but you only actually secrete 1.5 to 3 liters of urine a day. It really depends upon how much water you've taken in. Well, other factors too. There could be some pathology making you have increased urine. Control the filtration rate. So remember, the sympathetic impulses is what will decrease the glomerular filtration rate because that's what causes vasoconstriction of those afferent arterioles. So if you send less blood into the glomerulus because you constricted the afferent arterioles, then you're not going to produce as much filtrate. There's autoregulation happening, which we've talked about. But this other system, called the renin-angiotensin system, helps to control that filtrate. So the liver is going to release angiotensinogen, which is an inactive form. Kidney is going to release renin, and the renin will convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. In the lungs, there are enzymes that will convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction. It also increases the aldosterone secretion and antidiuretic hormone secretion and increases the thirst. All of these things are meant to increase our blood pressure. So if we have vasoconstriction, we have increased peripheral resistance. Increased aldosterone and increased ADH secretion are going to keep more fluids in our blood. And then increased thirst will make us drink more. Okay, tubular reabsorption of water and ions. So the proximal convoluted tubule is going to have a lot of sodium reabsorption. And that happens by active transport. So remember, even though sodium is in a lower concentration here, we're going to have to use some energy to get the sodium to move over into to be reabsorbed. When sodium, which is a positive ion, moves back into the blood, chlorine, which is a negative ion, will follow, and just because of that change in osmotic pressure, water will also follow. So when sodium goes, chlorine will follow because the negative is attracted to the positive, and then you're going to get water following because now this is a hypertonic environment. The proximal convoluted tubule reabsorbs about 70% of the water, chlorine, and sodium that were filtered out. Secretion of ions in the distal convoluted tubule, potassium specifically, and hydrogen ions, or I should say hydrogen ions, might passively diffuse in response to that active reabsorption of the sodium ions. So when sodium's actively reabsorbed, we need to balance out those ions with getting rid of some positive ones. All right, countercurrent mechanism is less complicated than the book makes it seem, but the countercurrent mechanism is how we maintain sodium chloride concentration gradient in this medullary interstitial fluid. So it's used to keep this medullary interstitial fluid, so the fluid around the cells or in this tissue, hypertonic. And we want to keep it hypertonic so we can concentrate the urine as much as possible. Because if this is hypertonic in here, which means it has a lot of solute, water is going to leave the collecting duct and enter the interstitial fluid, thereby concentrating the urine so we don't lose as much water. Countercurrent mechanism, vasa recta, is a little bit more complicated, but if you just think about it as water is going to follow where the salts are, and if we can increase the salt concentration, we can increase the water reabsorption. But the fluid in the ascending limb becomes hypotonic. So the fluid here is going to become hypotonic as the solute is reabsorbed. And then the fluid in the descending limb becomes hypertonic as it loses water just due to osmosis. Okay, effects of ADH on the renal tubules. Without ADH, the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct are impermeable to water. So the distal convoluted tubule, normally water can't pass through it. Same thing with the collecting duct, water can't pass through it. But when we have ADH, the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct become permeable to water, so water can pass through it. So with ADH, water gets reabsorbed by osmosis into the hypertonic medullary interstitial fluid. And we just talked back here about how we make this hypertonic. So when we have some ADH, remember, is secreted in response to low blood pressure. And if we want to keep water in the system, the ADH makes the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct permeable to water. Okay? And just remember from the endocrine system how the ADH is released from the posterior pituitary when the hypothalamus senses that decrease in blood pressure. All right, urea and uric acid excretion. Urea is a product of amino acid catabolism. So the plasma concentration of urea is really a reflection of how much protein you're eating. urea enters the renal tubules, and about 50% of it gets reabsorbed from the glomerular filtrate, and the rest of it is excreted. Uric acid is a product of nucleic acid metabolism. So anytime you eat a plant or an animal, you're going to get nucleic acids. And they enter the renal tubules through glomerular filtration. We usually reabsorb about 100%, and then 10% of it gets excreted, or secreted and excreted. Okay, so that's the end of part 2.